Dear Ambassador Andreas Fafernoschke, Vice Admiral Orlando Punsalan, Mr. Maurizio Noll, Project Manager for GIZ, Attorney Francis Acero, fellow Coast Guardians and GIZ colleagues, Mr. Sarmiento, Mr. Bishop, my fellow colleagues in government, in academia, civil society. Guten Morgen, magandang umaga po. And this is really a fantastic opportunity to be with my senior sir in the Philippine Coast Guard, again, proudly PCGA. And of course, a great opportunity to work with, I've always been looking for this opportunity. Finally, I have it to work, well, actually, I have already started working with Ambassador Fafernoschke in the German Embassy for something related to and I want you to research this, Coast Guardians, if you don't know about it yet, the biggest music event in the world. Well, I mean, at least in Europe. And we want to popularize, it's called the Eurovision Song Contest. We want to introduce it to the Philippines, so we're organizing a Europhil Song Contest. So maybe PCG, you can join. Anyway, pag may oras magkakaraoke tayo mamaya, okay lang? And again, we're very grateful for the strong support the Federal Republic of Germany has given to the Philippines. We're celebrating our 70th anniversary. And to fast forward, this cooperation, this assistance has been on many fronts: political, economic, cultural, of course, very importantly, strong support for our rightful stance with our maritime territory, our EEZ, and joint support for the rules-based international order. And this ultimately, what we're going to discuss in my talk is the background that we should know about international affairs, international relations, as a background. So actually, if I may, I'd also like to, since I'm also a PCGA officer, we're introducing also more education and training on international affairs for the PCGA. So we'd also like to extend this to the PCG. So this will be this is cut and paste from the module I'm giving for the PCGA on international relations and national and civilian security. So this is just a bit of patience. This is really a step back into better understanding how the world works and the role of DFA and where the PCG works with DFA. You'll get more detail about the hard facts and details about maritime security with our fellow Vanguard Brad, General Centino, when he talks this afternoon. So let's start. I'll give an overview first about the policy background of what we're doing. So talking about national security, development, and foreign policies. So all our, sort of the Bible of our policies, at least for national security, is with the National Security Plan and National Security Policy put out by the National Security Council. And the Philippines has a very broad definition of national security. It is, quote, a state or condition wherein the people's welfare, well-being, ways of life, government, and its institutions, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and core values are enhanced and protected. So it's not just military, security, affairs. It's just the Philippines as a country and everything in it. Its people, our culture, our independence. We protect that. So it's first, we have to remind ourselves of what national security is all about. It's just protecting the Philippines overall. Next slide, please. Now, anybody here who's a graduate of National Defense College? Or going to be, okay. So this is a very useful tool to understand how to safeguard our national security as being an officer enlisted of the Coast Guard, being ultimately an operator of UAVs, being involved in whatever work you do. Is a very useful tool on how to apply national security in whatever activity. And in National Defense College, we're called this PESTEM. So everything we do has these 6 dimensions. There's a political dimension, economic, social cultural, techno-scientific, environment, and military. So when we use UAVs, it has a great significance in these areas. So just something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Now, the national security policy, okay, so when I showed the definition, this has been around for decades, but in this administration of His Excellency President Bongbong Marcos, our vision for national security policy for this administration is more detailed, and really the role of the Coast Guard is highlighted in that our vision is that the Philippines is a free, resilient, peaceful, and prosperous maritime and archipelagic nation. So as the vanguard, as the guardians of our archipelago, you're front and center, or we are, in the joint PCG-PCGA team, all right. At peace with itself and its neighbors, so meaning domestic peace and order, domestic stability, and with our immediate neighbors, our neighbors also in the global community, where its citizens are equitably and culturally educated to reach their full potential through social cohesion and harmony, political stability, sound environmental management, international peace and cooperation, and economic progress through innovation and sustainable use of resources, enabled and protected by reliable defense and public safety systems. So UAV is a reliable defense and public safety system. So very much the UAV, the Coast Guard, is very key in implementing our vision for a stronger country. Next slide, please. But there's the national security side, and there's the national development side. So it's also very important to understand, it's like if you talk about the work of government, basically there are two halves, the security side and the prosperity side, the peace side and the prosperity side. So this is the vision of the Philippine Development Plan put out by anong agency? And the National Security Council puts out the National Security Plan. What is the agency that puts out the development plan? Anyone? Yes, NEDA, the National Economic Development Authority. So the vision here is, again, we try to make things concrete. So by 2040, the Philippines shall be a prosperous, predominantly middle-class society where no one is poor. Our people shall live long and healthy lives, be smart and innovative, and shall live in a high-trust society where families thrive in vibrant, cultural diverse, and resilient communities. So again, ultimately, the work we do as Coast Guardians and ultimately the UAV operators help fulfill also the development vision. Next slide, please. So how about us in Department of Foreign Affairs? Well, again, remember now, who determines Philippine foreign policy? It's the president. But otherwise, it's what we do in DFA is fleshed out. Well, long story short, we can define what we do in 4 thrusts. Number 1, protect the rights and welfare of overseas Filipinos. Again, we're part of the national security framework, economic diplomacy, our support to our development, and cultural diplomacy. So sometimes you hear about soft power, and one of the big examples of that is promoting food, promoting our entertainment, our language, our heritage. So cultural diplomacy is also very key and important. Okay, so the 4 roles of Philippine foreign policy and therefore Department of Foreign Affairs. Next slide, please. So now there are some terms that you might hear regarding international affairs, international relations. Sometimes they get mixed up. So it's good to also understand what these key terms are. One is when we talk about external relations, we talk about relations of a nation's state and non-state actors. When we say state, we mean the government. When we mean non-state actors, private sector, academe, NGOs, with state and non-state actors overseas. Now, so we talk about the external relations, say, of the Philippines. Now, when we talk about international relations, we talk about the whole system of relations among nation states, Philippines, Germany, European Union, ASEAN, UN. So again, we talk about individual countries, we talk about international organizations, and other international actors, because Shakespeare said the world is a stage. So it's like a big movie, but when we say actor, we mean who acts, countries, NGOs, coast guards, professors. This is what we mean by international actors. Then foreign policy are the plans and programs of a nation state for our international relations. Diplomacy is about implementing foreign policy by designated officials of a nation state, but it also can refer to diplomacy type work by businesses, universities, NGOs. And then common to all, you have a political, economic, cultural, and people-to-people aspect. So like the pillars of Philippine foreign policy. So what I would also like to help, this is also, if you don't mind, we'd also like a long-term relationship in supporting Germany's program in fleshing out and enhancing the capacity of the Coast Guard to be international actor. So if I may, this could be the first module of PCG diplomacy program. You get a certificate, there'll be recitation later. Exam, well, no, seriously. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now if we can move to the next slide, we have now some thoughts on the international role already of the PCG. So again, defining the PCG is your legal mandate. Next slide, please, is Republic Act 993. So the PCG is an armed and uniformed service, but also has a civilian character as an agency of the DOTC. And here's the key. In times of war, PCG forms part of the Department of National Defense, meaning you will return to your origins as initially the Coast Guard is part of the Philippine Navy. But also look at the history of the Philippine Coast Guard. There are different kinds of Coast Guards around the world, different kinds of models. So we have the American model, like most of ours, and also very strong similarity to other European and Western Coast Guards and navies. But in our case, we are a brother-sister to the Philippine Navy. And in time of war, like the US Coast Guard, we will operate with the DND and AFP. So, and ultimately now, as we know, the DND AFP is shifting to external defense. So external defense is already, well, the PCG is already practicing the external defense role, but it's something now that will be even stronger in time to come. Next slide, please. Then in RA 993, I just picked some of the key paragraphs. So one is A, to enforce regulations in accordance with all relevant maritime international conventions, treaties, or instruments. So again, as Ambassador Fafernoshke has mentioned, what is the mother of all maritime laws? The UNCLOS. But again, you'll have other lectures, and I'm sure you're already well familiar with the UNCLOS and other related maritime laws, and also our national laws, the SOLAS role, safety of life and property at sea within our maritime jurisdiction, and the conduct of port state control. Next slide, please. Then we look at K, to assist in the enforcement and maintenance of maritime security, prevention or suppression of terrorism at sea, and performance of law enforcement functions in accordance with pertinent laws, rules, and regulations. So we have right there, ultimately, the key general legal basis for the use of our UAVs. Next slide, please. Then if I could go over the specific roles we see of the PCG. We also have the L, assist in enforcement of laws on fisheries, immigration, tariff and customs, forestry, fire and explosive, human trafficking, dangerous drugs, controlled chemicals, transnational crimes, and other applicable laws within our maritime jurisdiction. But these things, they don't start at the borders of the Philippines. Like drug smuggling originates from some other country. Human trafficking, by definition, well, it's two-way. Usually before, when we talk about human trafficking, it's Filipinos being trafficked overseas. But now more and more, we are seeing people being trafficked into the Philippines. And this is another, if you've seen me, maybe you've seen me on TV, on the radio, we've been talking about tightening up visa regulations, particularly for Chinese. That's the gateway. So again, this is another area of cooperation. But yeah, ultimately, while it says this is within the maritime jurisdiction, no, we must think that these problems originate from the outside world. So really, this is key to the PCG's international role. Next slide, please. So again, what are the other, okay, so let's go, so this is not necessarily every, but these are the key things come to mind, is in terms of international security, we are all members of the United Nations. We are obliged to implement UN Security Council resolutions. In fact, this is something I'd worked on personally with the Coast Guard back in 2016 when there was a North Korean ship that was declared sanctioned by the UN Security Council, so the Coast Guard, we had to coordinate to impound it. I don't know if ever involved, maybe remember this case called the Jin Teng, a Sierra Leone flag, but ultimately North Korean ship that we impounded in Subic. Part of the drama is nagalit si President Aquino because he thought that I just did it because of my being macho, but no, it's because UN Security. So this is something that we have to understand, that UN Security Council resolutions have to be immediately implemented. This is part of our obligation, but also monitoring. So that's I mean, sanctions, and Coast Guard, the impounding of sanctioned ships that are suspected of ferrying funny things, basically weapons of mass destruction, CBRN. And of course, dealing with individual terrorists, for example. Then the counterterrorism role, international maritime law, enforcing conventions, the SOLAS, property at sea, port state control, of course. And of course, our key role here, maritime territory, safeguarding West Philippine Sea, EEZ. Again, we're all very familiar, so I won't go too much into detail of that because I want to cover the other things regarding international relations. Then we have joint Coast Guard patrols and operations, both sea and in air. And ultimately, we could look at this as joint activity with Germany with respect to UAVs as another form of ultimately patrol. Then there's the humanitarian assistance in disaster response, the HADR role, where, again, one of the things that we are both part of is the NDREAMC, National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council. And definitely Coast Guard will play a key role if and when we need international help, but also when we provide humanitarian assistance overseas, it would be great to help flesh out the PCG's role. Then, as we mentioned before, ultimately, we're part of in times of war, but even when we're not at war, we have to be interoperable with the DND, AFPP, and family. Of course, the whole marine environmental protection role. Next slide, please. Now, with Coast Guard diplomacy, it's when you are actually diplomats. So we have the IOM mission, part of our embassy in London. Did anyone serve in the PCG mission in London with the IOM or attended IOM conferences? Oh, something interesting. Then we have the ASEAN Coast Guard Forum. We have other regional maritime activity and bilateral maritime and Coast Guard cooperation, such as what we have very strongly with Germany and the GIZ. Then we have special roles. The Coast Guard was front and center in the management of the pandemic. And up until recently, I don't know, do you still deploy Coast Guards in the airports? Okay, very good. So I think one of the first uniformed people you see have been Coast Guard, Philippine Coast Guard. Then we have the K9 teams, and thank you for the K9 detachment in DFA. And here's something unique about the Coast Guard. You can deal openly with Taiwan. We can't because of the One China policy. Then, of course, again, support to the DFA, or security, system security. And, of course, a proud member of the PCGA. We are reactivating our PCGA DFA unit, the 130th Squadron. Okay, next slide, please. So looking ahead, where can we see stronger cooperation building on what we have already? Well, one is that Philippines is running for non-permanent membership in the UN Security Council for 2027, 2028. So we want to demonstrate that the Philippines, particularly through the Coast Guard, has been a partner, strong partner in implementing Security Council resolutions, particularly on counterterrorism, sanctions, and the sanctions usually apply to CBRN, WMD component smuggling. Then there is, again, growing incidents of Filipino mariners. As you know, we have the world's largest deployment of seafarers captured by the Houthis by the Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf. I'm not sure exactly what the protocol is for the Coast Guard, but that's something very interesting to look at. Then stronger partnerships with humanitarian, DRM, maritime safety. Now the blue economy is looking at economic development of our oceans. And what's happening now with the incursions on West Philippine Sea threatens our blue economy. Now, something that I'd really love to help develop is with Germany, with Europe, is a stronger sense of community in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly Germany being a core member of European Union and friends of Germany, Now, historically, I don't know if you know that Germany was a Pacific power. Samoa was a German colony. In fact, like we have mestizos here, like the Eigenmanns. You also have German Samoan mestizos who are very prominent in Samoan society. And I was ambassador there before. Oh, Prof. Reg, what's the time check? How many minutes? Okay, but I don't want to bore everyone, but just roughly how many minutes do I have left? Okay, good. So, all right. Now, this is also something I'm very excited about, is that in the Pacific Island countries, so Philippines, as we are a maturing country, we also want to be have our own GIZ, and we sort of do. So are you familiar with, in the DFA, we have something called the Technical Cooperation Council of the Philippines. So it's like a baby. One day will be like GIZ, where we provide technical support to other countries. And I'm looking forward to, now, interesting thing about Samoa, they also have, again, like us, we've renounced war as an instrument of national policy, but they do not have armed forces. But they do have police forces, maritime forces. So, long story short, maybe a triangular cooperation with Germany into helping develop the Samoa Coast Guard, for example. So, when we're projecting our soft power, we can share the Philippine experience in how we develop Coast Guards, how we develop our maritime law enforcement, for example. And then, of course, now, then this is really the connection, that the challenge of, well, this is actually the other part of the UAV thing. So UAV is something, at least we're firmly in control. It is an aerial asset for surveillance, for monitoring, for law enforcement, but there's also the problem UAVs are a threat to us. What do I mean? Well, not ours, but others. And we use the term lethal autonomous weapon systems. How many of you watched the movie Terminator or The Matrix? I'll be back. So the problem is with AI. How many of you use ChatGPT to write your reports? Don't do that. That's wrong. I don't know. Okay, in the AFP, when you have to do paperwork, they call it rotting. Do you have that same idea, Sana, PCG? When you have to do paperwork report, rotting. And there's a temptation, because if you're lazy, you just use AI to type up your annual post. I don't do that. So what that means, there is also the scary side of using new technologies like this. And again, these are unmanned aerial vehicles. So, well, we should be piloting them. Humans should be piloting them. But there's also technology you can let AI. What if we lose control? Or they develop their own, like again, you watch these science fiction movies, they develop their own consciousness. And they think, okay, because they're very logical, they come to the logical conclusion. Salo talaga mga tao, or humans are actually a pest. So, I mean, this is far-fetched, but no, actually it's not far-fetched. But again, this is also something where the DFA can work closely with PCG. Again, also PCG, we're facing, well, all government agencies are facing the threat of hacking, for example. And interesting, there's this interesting, I think we talked about this in one forum, Ambassador, that if we're going to protest Chinese incursion, well, not just Chinese, but foreign incursions on our territory, our EEZ, shouldn't we also protest incursions on our cyberspace? Shouldn't we also protest hacking incidents? And I don't know about supposed fake communication, conversations that have been illicitly taped. You know what I'm talking about. With involving our dear friend, but he's from the Navy in Westcom. Okay, I could talk about that later. Okay, and again, help us with the revival of the PCGA unit, and also developing a corps of ambassadors for the PCG. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll just go through this very quickly, and I may just skip some. I'll just go straight to some other points. Okay, when you talk about international relations, again, that's a sum of our interaction, and we are in a state of anarchy. What do we mean by anarchy? Not like, well, anarchy is a technical international law term, is that basically the problem with international law and the rules-based international orders, how do you enforce it? Like in a country which has sovereignty, yes, you have the police, you have law enforcement, that laws must be strictly followed and they're enforced. How can laws be enforced internationally? Well, we have the mechanism of the United Nations. We have now our arbitral decision. But the key is, how can it be enforced if one country does not recognize the jurisdiction? So this has always been a challenge. So if we can't have it from above, at least we have like-minded countries like Germany who support our legal claims, or what is due and right under that rules-based, meaning we follow rules. But it's like almost like you tell some kids to govern themselves and you don't have the teacher telling them what to do. So that's always very tricky. Okay, anyway, so that's what we mean by anarchy. And there's hard power, there's soft power. Now, when we talk about how a certain country is acting, they say might makes right, meaning, well, if we're stronger than you, you have to, well, we're going to do what we want to do. We don't have to listen to you. But other ways, we have to follow also right makes might, meaning we have the sight of international law. We have the sight of, although it's not a popular concept in the world today, morality, ethics on our side. Okay, next slide, please. So how you look at the world, there are different concepts of international relations. Just similar, like some are realists that you talk about might, liberal, let's all try to get along, Marxist, class struggle, constructivist, let's try to build a better world, feminist, well, most of the world's problems are with idiot men, and pachydermist also. Okay, now, if I had more time, we'll do karaoke for each song. So like the realist talks about power. We are the champions, my friend. We'll keep on fighting till the end. Actually, when I think of a German song, 99 Luftballons by Nena, 99 red balloons. Do you know that song? 99 red balloons. It's basically, it's a interesting song, but because this was during the Cold War, 99 red balloons basically went into, I guess, Soviet territory, and the Soviets thought that was an invasion, so they launched their nuclear weapon. Okay, well, unfortunately, we seem to be returning to that kind of dangerous world. Anyway, something that we have to understand is that there are different ways of looking at the world. Is it about power? Is it about liberal, focusing on how to have better relations? Is it about Marxist, meaning that it's all about class struggle? Or is it constructivist? Actually, this is a very positive way also, is that let's try to build relations with each other through the United Nations, through ASEAN, cooperation, European, so on. Anyway, that's something we could discuss further on. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, Philippine foreign policy. Okay, maybe quick. So, again, foreign policy, it's basically the key thing is that it's complex. And decisions, well, like in Philippine government, is it more because of a single leader? Is it more because of a group, meaning cabinet with the Congress? Is it coalition, including other power groups? Well, again, this is a long discussion, but suffice it to say that it can be very complex how our foreign policy made. But again, the key thing to remember is it is the president who is the architect, and we all support the presidency. Next slide, please. So we have the constitutional basis, so that's where ultimately, okay, we know, okay, let's go to, next slide. Again, we have the pillars. There are three pillars defined in RA 7157. National security, overseas Filipinos, economic security. Next slide, please. But then cultural diplomacy was left out, but we'll bring back into these four pillars, which I mentioned. Next slide, please. And then, again, the president is the chief architect. The secretary of foreign affairs is a cabinet member in charge of implementing foreign policy. The DFA is the agency in charge of foreign policy. And here's the key thing. The foreign service refers to the embassies, consulates, and the ambassadors and the consuls. Philippine foreign, it's like saying what PCG to DOTC, AFP to DND. Next slide, please. Now, here's the key thing to understand. We maintain we have an independent foreign policy. What does that mean? We are friend to all and enemy to none. Our policy is determined by the Philippine, not because of a foreign government, and Filipino, not foreign interests, are paramount. Now, does number one sound like BS? No, because remember, ultimately, number one, because we've renounced war, as a policy, we cannot really have declared enemies like countries have had in the past. In international law, in the UN system, the use of force by a country against another country can only be done in two circumstances. And what is that? Number one, in self-defense, and number two, approved by United Nations through the Security Council. That's why we have peacekeeping operations. So, but let's look at China. Is it an enemy? Well, right now, we do not have any declared enemies. We have a country, but we have to put things in perspective because of the four pillars. Where do we have the problem? It's in national security. But in terms of economic diplomacy, in terms of cultural diplomacy, in terms of people, actually relations are good. So hopefully we can isolate just our problems within that sector. And we are still, although the water cannons are used, protests are made, declarations are made, we counter, but we still try to keep it within, short of going to war. This is something we must avoid at all costs. But how we do it, well, this is the challenge we all face. Next slide, please. Okay, now, what are the things that factor in for informality? Well, okay, obviously East Asia, ASEAN, Europe, Islamic community, UN, trade for development, international tourism, overseas Filipinos, then also crisis. So these are among the big issue frames we have to contend with. Also the PCG. Next slide, please. Then particular challenges, West Philippine Sea, external defense relations, civilian security, natural man-made threats, overseas Filipinos, economic, culture. Okay, so actually we touched on that earlier. Next slide, please. Now, what are the key things that our president has declared? The number one, we want ultimately peace in the Indo-Pacific region. And remember now, only the last few years we started to use the term Indo-Pacific, not just Asia-Pacific, because we see strong connections what happens around the Indian Ocean, by India, by east coast of Africa, which strongly affect what we do in the Pacific. But maybe at one point we also talk about Indo-Pacific Atlantic, since our cooperation with Germany and Europe is becoming all the stronger. Then partnerships, stronger ASEAN role, and of course economic agenda. Remember, the president had personally taken charge of the Department of Agriculture because food security is a top priority, power, infrastructure, digital transformation, United Nations leadership. We have the Manila Declaration in the General Assembly that countries should solve issues peacefully. We're proud we initiated that, 1981. Of course, we are a candidate for UN Security Council membership, and we want to make a return to UN peacekeeping, and we'd love to see a role for the Coast Guard also to have a role in UN peacekeeping. Then renewed security ties, US, Australia, Japan, of course, Europe. Next slide, please. Okay, we talk about diplomacy. So actually, I'd say diplomacy, not prostitution, is the world's oldest profession. Why? Because if diplomacy is about agreements, what's the first agreement or treaty between God and man? Don't eat the apple, the Treaty of Eden. So if the diplomat is a negotiator, who was the first negotiator? It was the snake who negotiated with Eve to break the treaty. So that's right, just okay for fun. Next slide, please. Okay, so ultimately diplomacy is about implementation of foreign policy, its relationship with countries, peoples, being messengers. The Archangel Gabriel is a patron saint, you see it in the Bible. Why is the fleur de lis the symbol of diplomacy? Because that's the flower that Archangel Gabriel had. It's also, he is the icon of diplomacy in Islam and Judaism, the Abrahamic religions. We talk about types of diplomacy. There's the track 1, which is governmental, track 2, NGO business, academe, track 3, persons. Next slide, please. Okay, sorry, I know this is a lot, but you get a copy of the PowerPoint. Next slide, please. Okay, but also if we talk about what is the role of a diplomat, when I taught this before, this was in Miriam when we had SM, North EDSA just opened early 90s. We talked about everybody like going to SM. So remember SM, 3 SMs, SM, SM, SM. So what are the roles? Soldier, we're the front line of defense. Spy, of course, we check out what's happening in other countries. Sundo. So Ambassador, this, as you may know this term, Sundo is a Philippine word for receiving people and bringing people to the airport, or protocol role, which is. And then mother, we have to care for overseas Filipinos. Messenger, the classic role of the diplomat is the line of communication between countries. And merchant, we sell the country, our goods, products, services, culture. So this is our role. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's one way to remember, if you do these t-shirts about diplomacy, the ability to tell somebody to go to hell but have them look forward to it. Next slide, please. Okay, but ultimately, one of the most powerful assets of the Philippines are our diaspora of 11 million overseas Filipinos around the world. Next slide, please. So again, we have different types of diplomacy: bilateral, one-on-one, regional, we talk about particular group of countries, particularly ASEAN; multilateral, and we talk about the UN and the global system. Next slide, please. Then again, as mentioned, track 1, 2, and 3, government, non-government, and people. But there's a 1.5 when we have like think tanks and universities talk about issues like the West Philippine Sea. That's kind of in the middle, so we refer that to a 1.5 activity. Next slide, please. Then again, the political, economic, cultural. Consular is the way you could say is the one-on-one, but passports, visas, the individual needs when you need the help of DFA. Next slide, please. And then we have embassies, which are, okay, what are the difference between these offices? Embassy is basically a foreign affairs office in the capital city. A consulate is a foreign affairs office in a city that's not a capital. A mission is basically an embassy to international organizations like the UN or ASEAN. And honorary consulates are basically consulates who are manned by volunteers, but usually lawyers or businessmen. Next slide, please. Then we have, here's a key thing, and maybe I could wind up there because I'm running out of time, but I think this is critical to understand our role and where we work together, is that how do we concretize the work of diplomacy? One is that we have treaties, which are formal agreements between and among countries. The UNCLOS, you could say, is such a treaty. They can be covering many countries, like the UNCLOS, or one-on-one, like the MDT, Mutual Defense Treaty with the US. Then there's executive agreements, but a treaty will need to be double-checked or ratified by the legislature, in our case, the Philippine Senate. An agreement is a high-level agreement, but it doesn't need to go through the Senate. A MOU or MOA is just less formal agreements, like maybe the UAVs are covered, perhaps, by a MOU, MOA between Germany and the Philippines. Note verbal is the formal written communications. When you write to an embassy, it follows a certain format. Like, again, PCG, you have certain format in writing letters. Now, here's the thing. How do we complain, particularly, let's say, in the case of China? Well, when they do something naughty, at the very least, we send a note saying, oh, why are you doing this? You shouldn't do this. Or, many times, we call the ambassador and tell you, Ambassador Andreas, have you ever been summoned? He's a good ambassador. Oh, no, again, it's nothing, it's not personal. It's because, country X is not doing, but also, so you probably read in the Secretary Ricky has, or Yusek Lazaro, because again, our undersecretary who deals more in the one-on-one with China, that's Yusek Tess Lazaro. So they summon the ambassador, but also sometimes when China's not happy with us, they summon our ambassador in Beijing, Ambassador Jaime Forcos, and tell, or if things really get bad, we can kick them out. We can expel them. But if we do that, the problem is then they'll retaliate. But you see a lot of that going on. Well, so far with us, we haven't. Some have been calling for the expulsion, but we say, well, the problem when you do that, there's tit for tat, there's retaliation. Now, aide memoire, again, is a written record of a meeting. Now, this is very important because there's this supposed tape of a conversation between a certain admiral, not PCG, and certain officials of the Chinese government. However, that's not official. That's not binding. If you want to have something binding between a conversation, you have to have a note, aide memoire, a written record. Just like in the PCG, like the government agencies. Maybe if you have a little time, I'll just go through other things that would be of interest. Next slide, please. Okay, again, diplomacy, first slide. Okay, never mind. Next slide. DFA, next slide, next slide. Okay, my office. Okay, I think we'll end there. My office is called UXCA, Office of the Undersecretary for Civilian Security and Consular Affairs. So if you need passports, need visas, come to me. I won't charge you too much. No, I'm just kidding. Again, you're entitled to at least official passports, which are good. But okay. Now, most of the interaction of the German embassy and the PCG with DFA is actually another office. It's for first Office of European Affairs, what we call the geographic offices. There's Office of European Affairs, Asia Pacific Affairs, Middle East Africa Affairs, and American Affairs. Most of the one-on-one relationships are through that office. Then we have the MOAU, Maritime, Ocean, and Affairs Office, which, again, it's frontline for West Philippine Sea, UNCLOS issues. But when do you come to me? When does UCSA? We represent DFA. So maybe understand, what do we mean by civilian security? It's whatever I want it to mean. Well, basically, it's security issues that affect civilians, but that means natural or man-made disasters. But maybe a better way to understand what my job is and how we can work together is where do I represent DFA? One, National Security Council. Number two, Anti-Terrorism Council, National Intelligence Board, NDREAMC, the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council, the CAAP, Civil Aviation Authority of the Philippines Board, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region Muslim Mindanao, Mindanao Development Authority. So more or less, I'm the focal point for Mindanao. National NSEAC, National Cybersecurity Interagency Council, Dangerous Drugs Board, National Task Force on Ending Communist Local Armed Conflict, NAP, Countering Violent Extremism, and so on. Okay, so again, those of you who are handling these issues, I'll be happy to help. Okay, maybe just run through it. Just next slide. Next slide. Okay, so we have 245 offices around the world, counting honorary consulates. Next slide, please. Our functions, again, basically it's promoting the pillars overseas. Next slide, please. We have a one-country team approach where we work closely with other attachés, including the Coast Guard attaché in London. Next slide, please. Chart of how an embassy operates. Okay, next slide. Diplomatic life, well, this is me in the UN. This is our chancery or work. Okay, in the embassy there are two offices. The chancery is called the working office. So notice the Lord of the Rings type architecture. Next slide, please. This is my residence, like Downton Abbey. Next slide, please. This is my presentation credentials, where there's a ceremony where you present your letter from your president saying, oh, hey, here's the ambassador. So the first part is very much like our Katutubo native practice. And bottom line is more conventional review of the honor guard. Next slide, please. How we help, like example of helping Filipinos in Baghdad, right, teaching Filipino language and culture to an elementary school. Next slide. We also work together to safeguard against COVID. Next slide. Joining the DFA. Well, if you want to join, well, we're not okay. If you want to join the DFA, this is the process. If you want, next slide. Okay, so Dakila is a network we're trying to do that will be network our friends and officers from the security sector. Next slide. Okay, so that's it. Maraming salamat po. Sorry for going over. Okay.